The photograph is small, stiff, and ordinary at first glance. A child sits in a plain dress, posture too rigid for comfort, hands arranged as if instructed to remain still. The room behind her is unremarkable, the kind of institutional space meant to erase personality. Yet the longer the eyes linger, the more the image begins to feel less like a record and more like an encounter. In 1871, cameras were believed to tell the truth. A lens did not flatter. A glass plate did not imagine. If a photograph looked wrong, it was assumed the subject was wrong. And in a hospital built to contain the unexplainable, the wrongness of a single portrait was enough to become a legend. To understand why, the story has to begin far from that corridor in a Boston neighborhood packed tight with new arrivals and old grief. The Civil War had ended only a few years earlier, and the city, or the aftermath in its uneven prosperity. Ships brought wealth into the harbor. Streets brought hunger into tenements. In the North End, Irish families lived close together in small rooms where prayers did double duty as comfort and discipline. Catherine Doyle was born into that world in the spring of 1862. The only child of Patrick and Mary Doyle, her father worked the docks, hauling crates with hands that never fully softened. A mother cleaned the homes of people whose floors never stayed dirty long enough to remind them poverty existed. Their apartment was cramped, their neighborhood loud, and their days ran on a strict rhythm of church, school, work, and survival. By every surviving description, Catherine fit into that rhythm perfectly. She learned her letters at the usual pace. She helped with small chores and played with whatever could be turned into a toy. She attended Mass at St. Leonard's, repeating Latin prayers as sounds more than meaning, the way children often do. Teachers called her attentive, polite, unremarkable, in the best possible way. Nothing in those early years suggested that her name would later be spoken in the same breath as the darkest medical mysteries of the century. The change arrived without warning, and that suddenness became one of the most unsettling details of all. It was mid-September of 1869. The city was cooling toward autumn. The family's routine was fixed enough that Mary would later remember the date as precisely as a birthday. Catherine rose later than usual. When she entered the kitchen, she moved with an odd deliberation, as if each step required calculation. She did not greet her parents. She sat down and stared. Mary asked if she felt sick. Catherine answered, but the voice was wrong. Not wildly different, not theatrical, just altered enough to make a mother's instincts recoil. It carried a roughness, a maturity, as if the tone belonged to someone older, boring a child's throat. At first, Patrick and Mary tried to interpret the change as illness or mood. Children have strange days. Children mimic adults. Children go quiet. The mind searches for normal explanations because the alternatives are unbearable. Then the dinner table comments began. Catherine spoke about history with a precision that did not match her schooling. She described battles and dates as if recalling a memory rather than reciting a lesson. Waiting. When Patrick pressed her, she did not fumble or improvise. She smiled, a small, contained expression that felt more like amusement than affection, and said she had always known. Within weeks, the knowledge turned sharper, stranger, and far more intimate. She recited Latin not as prayer, but as fluent speech, producing passages that priests usually needed to locate on a page. She spoke of philosophers with familiarity that belonged in universities, not in a North End parochial classroom. The household began to feel as though an unseen guest had taken a seat among them, listening and learning without ever being introduced. Then came the secrets. Catherine began to mention things that were not meant for children, not meant for anyone outside locked conversations in private shame. She alluded to debts, to infidelities, to miseries hidden behind polite nods. She spoke of neighbors' lives as if she had been present for confessions no one remembered making. The effect was immediate. Adults stopped speaking freely in her presence. Conversations ended when she entered a room. Faces tightened. Kay, in a community held together by rumor and faith. A child who seemed to know too much became a kind of social toxin. Her interests changed with the same abruptness as her voice. She began describing death with unsettling precision. She asked questions that did not sound like curiosity, but like inventory, methods of execution, the mechanics of torture, the ways disease dismantled the body. She spoke of suffering with a calm that made listeners feel trapped in a room with the wrong kind of witness. At the same time, she began turning pain inward. Scratches became cuts. Bites became wounds. She struck her own head against hard surfaces, not in panic, but in a steady ritual, as if testing limits. When Mary tried to intervene, Catherine resisted with a composure that felt unnatural in a child. Worse than the injuries was her expression during them. There was no pleading, no fear, no regret. There was something like focus, something like satisfaction. Animals reacted before adults fully admitted what they were seeing. Stray cats vanished from the yard. Dogs barked and backed away. Even birds seemed to scatter when she stepped outside. When asked why, Catherine answered with a coldness that did not belong in a family kitchen. She said the animals understood what people refused to. By the winter of 1869, the changes were no longer confined to words and behavior. Objects broke in her hands with a force that did not match her small frame. Wooden furniture splintered. Impressions appeared on the table as if pressed by tools rather than fingers. She held uncomfortable positions for hours without fatigue. She walked into freezing weather, underdressed, and returned without shivering. The family's fear became public, and public fear becomes pressure. They sought the church first, because the church was the oldest language they had for the unexplainable. Father Timothy O'Brien had known Catherine since infancy. He had blessed her, watched her grow, and assumed the parents were describing stress, misinterpretation, a child acting out. When he met her, the assumption collapsed. Catherine spoke with him as if testing him. Her theological understanding was dense, argumentative, unsettlingly confident. Then she did something that drained the color from the priest's face. She referenced private moments from his past, doubts he had never confessed, memories from an Irish childhood town an ocean away. The priest left the meeting shaken. In the weeks that followed, he agreed to perform a ritual intended to confront possession. The details of that night were never fully shared, but one image persisted in the accounts that survived. Catherine did not scream. She did not thrash. She laughed, and the laughter sounded layered, as if more than one voice occupied the same air. When the priest began the Latin, Catherine followed him word for word, anticipating each line like someone reading from a script she already knew. After that, faith could no longer reassure the Doyles. They turned to medicine, to the newest authority of the era. Though psychiatric science was still a rough discipline stitched together from observation and coercion. A specialist named Dr. Henry Morrison examined Catherine and documented what he could. Writing with the restraint of a man trying to keep his own fear out of his notes, he recorded intelligence that leaned toward the macabre. He described drawings of skeletons and decomposing bodies, rendered with the competence no child should possess. He noted her use of languages she had never studied, as if the words arrived fully formed when she required them. He also wrote about her eyes, not their color, not their shape, but the sensation of being observed by something older than childhood. As a doctor trained to watch patients felt watched back. Then came the night that forced a decision. A snowstorm crawled over Boston. Patrick woke with the sense that the house was wrong. Catherine was gone from her bed. He searched every room and found nothing until he looked out the kitchen window. In the backyard, in the storm, a small figure stood motionless, arms angled upward, as if receiving the weather. Snow gathered on her shoulders. Her nightgown clung thinly to her body. She did not sway. She did not tremble. Patrick ran to her, expecting to find a child near death. Her skin was freezing, but her breathing was calm. When he tried to lift her, she turned her head. Her eyes were black. Not simply dilated, not shadowed by poor light, but black in a way that erased the normal anatomy of the eye. And when she spoke, her voice seemed to carry beyond her mouth, as if the air itself was speaking alongside her. She told her father the stars were nearly aligned, and when they reached the correct position, he would understand that Catherine had never really existed. By morning, the family's choices had narrowed to a single brutal path. If Catherine stayed home, she might die. She might harm herself. She might harm others. She might drag the entire neighborhood into panic. In that era, the solution to unsolvable fear had an address. Danvers State Hospital stood outside the city like a fortress built for the mind's failures. Gothic towers, long corridors, locked wards, a promise of modern treatment on paper, the reality of containment in practice. Catherine arrived in March of 1870. She did not cry. She did not cling to her parents. She behaved like someone who had already accepted the destination. In the carriage, she turned once to Dr. Morrison and remarked that he would try to photograph her. She spoke as if she understood what a camera might reveal. At Danvers, she met Dr. Elias Hartwell, a physician who believed careful documentation could tame even the strangest case. He expected childhood hysteria, trauma, or some rare developmental condition. He did not expect a child who walked into his office and named patients who had died, including details that lived only in confidential files. He did not expect her to mention private facts from his own life with the casual precision of someone reading a diary. Catherine was placed among other children at first, and that is when the story expanded beyond a single patient. Within days, other children began changing. They sat for hours staring at empty corners. They stopped responding to staff. They spoke of a tall woman in black, described with identical details across multiple mouths, as if they were all witnessing the same figure moving through the ward. More unsettling than the visions was the knowledge that followed. Children began describing Catherine's life in Boston with specificity none of them should possess. A boy who had barely spoken began recounting details about relatives and stories that did not exist in any hospital record. The children moved in odd coordinated patterns, sitting in geometric arrangements during meals, speaking in unison at moments that felt rehearsed by an invisible conductor. Danvers had seen hysteria before. Danvers had seen imitation and suggestion. This did not feel like either. The staff began to suspect that whatever was happening around Catherine was not confined to her alone. Hartwell moved her into isolation, a small, spare room with an iron bed, a table, and barred light. The goal was control. In private sessions, Catherine began turning the doctor into the subject. She questioned him with surgical precision, probing insecurities that most people barely admitted to themselves. She described a tragedy from his childhood, the drowning of a girl, with details that matched his memory so exactly he could not dismiss it as guesswork. Around her room, odd phenomena accumulated like a second case file written in temperatures and shadows. The air inside remained colder than the rest of the building. Its plants withered near her window. Nurses reported headaches and nightmares that began only after their shifts in her corridor. Guards complained of being watched, even when the room was quiet. Hartwell attempted experiments suited to the tools of his time, measuring what could be measured and recording what could not. Catherine continued to provide information about strangers from photographs, naming details later confirmed as accurate. She began making predictions about deaths within the hospital that arrived on schedule, as if time itself were obeying her language. As the year turned, her body began to fail in ways that made no sense even to doctors accustomed to malnutrition and disease. She grew thinner, paler, almost translucent. Then came the rigid spells, hours of motionless stillness during which her eyes remained open and alert. During those episodes, the room seemed to change around her. The temperature dropped. Objects shifted. Staff members described dizziness and nausea as if the air had become hostile. In 1871, Hartwell made the decision that would preserve Catherine's name long after her death. He ordered a photograph. He wanted something objective, a fixed record, untouched by fear or imagination. If people saw different things when they looked at her, perhaps the camera would settle the argument. A medical photographer named James Thornton arrived with heavy equipment, glass plates, and chemical solutions. He expected the usual challenges of institutional portraiture. What he found was a room where the light seemed wrong, as if the air swallowed brightness near the child in the chair. Catherine sat still, already posed, already aware of what the camera required. When she looked into the lens, Thornton felt the room change. Cold rushed across his skin. He later said, "It felt as if you were being examined by the act of photographing." The exposure took long seconds, the kind that forced stillness. During that stillness, the atmosphere thickened with a quiet that felt like attention. The plate developed strangely. Chemistry behaved as if it were reacting to more than light. When the image finally emerged, Hartwell and Thornton stared without speaking. Catherine was there, exactly as expected, and yet the photograph felt different from reality. Her eyes seemed to follow the viewer from any angle. They appeared to contain depth that should not exist on a flat surface. Shadows gathered at the edges that did not match the room's light. Shapes suggested themselves like figures just outside the frame, caught halfway between exposure and concealment. Control photographs taken afterward came out clean. Same room, same chemicals, same equipment. The difference seemed to be Catherine. After that day, her decline accelerated. The rigid states grew longer, turning hours into days. The cold in her room deepened until ice formed in places it should not. Objects moved with greater force, as if the unseen pressure in the air had grown impatient. Stab began requesting transfers, writing that something around the child felt contagious, not medically, but emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. In September of 1871, Catherine entered a stillness that did not end. Weeks passed. She did not eat. She did not drink. Yet her eyes remained open, tracking movement, focusing on corners, as if listening to someone who stood just beyond human sight. Her lips sometimes moved in whispers without sound. On November 2nd, she died quietly. In the moment, her breathing stopped. The room's temperature rose to normal for the first time in months. It was as if a pressure had been released, as if the hospital itself exhaled. An autopsy offered no closure. Organs appeared healthy. No obvious disease explained her death. Hartwell noted unusual patterns in the brain, development in some regions beyond expectation, in other areas strangely underformed. Even her body's decomposition seemed delayed, as if ordinary processes hesitated. After burial in the hospital cemetery, reports continued. Plants struggled to grow above the grave. The air seemed colder near the plot. Visitors described discomfort, the sense of being watched, the urge to leave without knowing why. Hartwell spent the rest of his career writing about the case. His notes circulated among doctors who disagreed on interpretation, but agreed on one thing. The documentation was too meticulous to ignore. The photograph moved through medical circles like a rumor made physical. Some called it a defect. Others called it a rare condition. A few hinted at forces they would not name in professional language. Decades later, psychologists and researchers revisited the case through modern frameworks, proposing neurological explanations, dissociation, unusual perception, rare disorders that might imitate the impression of impossible knowledge. These theories could touch parts of the story, but they left other parts untouched, like fingerprints that did not match the hand. That is why the photograph remains unsettling. It is not simply the image of a child in a hospital chair. It is the suggestion that something can be recorded without being understood. A camera can preserve a question in silver and glass, and the question can outlive everyone who tried to answer it. Catherine Doyle lived 9 years. In that short span, she passed through the worlds of family, faith, and medicine, leaving each with the same bruise of uncertainty. Her story sits at the edge of what people insist must be explainable, and it refuses to be pushed fully into any single category. In the end, the mystery is not only what happened to her. The deeper unease is what her case implies about the boundaries people rely on. The boundary between knowledge and innocence. The boundary between mind and body. The boundary between what is seen and what is merely sensed. That is the quiet power of the photograph from 1871. It does not scream. It does not move. It simply waits, with eyes that seem to look back, daring the living to decide what they believe is possible.